Hey, good morning. I'm Patricia Murphy. It's Thursday. This is Seattle Now. Washington is quickly embracing clean electric energy, but there's only so much of it to go around, especially during extreme weather. So now electric companies are looking to lessen the load by remotely controlling energy use. Seattle Times Climate Lab reporter Greg Kim will talk about this new program in a minute. But first, let's get you caught up. You can weigh in tonight on Mayor Katie Wilson's proposed library levy. It would raise $410 million. If approved, it would pay for a number of things, including books, all-ages programming, and seismic upgrades at the Columbia City branch. The owner of a median-valued home would pay about $160 a year in property taxes. There's a public hearing tonight before the Seattle City Council. It starts at 5:30. Speaking of the council, members will get an update this morning on Seattle's NBA readiness. Leaders with Climate Pledge Arena, the Seattle Sports Commission, and even former NBA player and Seattleite Spencer Hawes will be there. Last week, the NBA Board of Governors voted to explore expansion to Seattle and Las Vegas. Tip-off for this morning's City Council meeting is at 9:30. And the Tacoma City Council is calling on the Sound Transit Board to prioritize light rail projects planned for Tacoma and Pierce County. The agency recently announced that some future projects may be delayed or killed altogether due to a long-term budget shortfall of $35 billion. Tacoma leaders say the need for high-capacity transit in South Sound has never been greater, and the long-promised Tacoma extension has already been delayed 5 years. We'll be back with more headlines on tonight's episode of Seattle Now. As a climate-conscious city, Seattle aims to embrace electricity over fossil fuels. Because of that, our local electric utilities can struggle to supply enough electricity. Demand for power is up, especially during extreme weather. One solution electric companies have devised is remotely controlling thermostats. It's supposed to save money for consumers and decrease strain on the system, but it also means people have less control over their living spaces. Seattle Times Climate Lab reporter Greg Kim is here to break it down. Thanks, Greg.
Thanks for having me, Trish.
Electricity in Washington is a game of supply and demand. So let's start by helping listeners understand Seattle's energy supply. Where does it come from, and does it come at a consistent rate?
Washington's pretty unique in that about 60% to two-thirds of our power comes from hydropower. But like you said, the supply and demand in our state has both changed pretty considerably over the last decade. On the demand side, we've got more adoption of electric vehicles, and that uses a lot of electricity. Homes changed their heating methods from gas furnaces to electric heat pumps. And so there's a lot more energy being consumed overall, not to mention data centers, which raises our floor for demand overall as well. On the supply side, we've seen some lower years of hydropower output over the last several years because of a lackluster snowfall over the winters in the mountains. And at the same time, our Clean Energy Act in Washington State is requiring utilities to power down their coal power plants and replace them with renewable sources like wind and solar. Those newer sources, they don't always supply power all the time. And sometimes a dip in supply can coincide with a spike in demand.
Let's talk about how demand shifts over time and based on weather or even time of day, Greg.
Demand has always spiked at specific times of the year and during the day. Let's start with the day, which is when people are home from the hours that they wake up until they go to work, and in the few hours that they return home from work after their commute. Those are the times when electricity usage is highest. That's when people are running their heat, they're running their appliances. And so electricity always spikes during those hours of the day. And then over the course of a year, that power spikes again in the coldest winter months when people are using a lot of energy to heat their homes. and in the hottest months of the year as well, increasingly now as we've had some hotter summers and people are adding air conditioning into their homes. When those two things combine, which is, the hours when people come home after work on, say, the coldest days of the year during a cold snap, that's when electricity usage spikes the absolute most. And that's when all the utilities in the state and region are competing to buy power on the open market. And all that competition drives up prices incredibly high. And so the idea that utilities have is, well, if we can kind of reduce or shift over that electricity hours in those hours just a little bit, that can, one, reduce the amount that we need to pay these incredibly high prices, and it can reduce those prices overall by reducing demand.
Okay, so consumers are out there living their best lives in the morning and heating their homes as much as they possibly can when it's cold, which creates this supply problem, which creates a spike in prices for companies like Puget Sound Energy and Seattle City Light. What does this mean for me, the consumer?
Utilities have been raising rates somewhat dramatically in the last few years. I don't have the numbers right off the top of my head, but in some cases like 25% or higher in a single year. And that is at least largely driven by these specifically high demand times. The costs that utilities are having to pay during these peaks is a big driver for those rate increases.
Greg, tell me about this thermostat program from Puget Sound Energy.
Yeah, so how it works is during rush hour events, which is those times that we talked about when energy demand spikes the most. That's when people with smart thermostats can say, okay, Puget Sound Energy, you can have control of my thermostat, and when you need to, turn it down a little bit. So during these times, PSC will automatically shift down people's thermostats a couple degrees in the winter, or shift them up a couple degrees on the hottest days of the summer. And that's one way they're reducing energy usage.
Well, Greg, tell me how much control customers got to maintain over their thermostats, because I like my house pretty warm in the winter.
Yeah, most people do. So people would opt into this program, right? So this isn't something that's mandated upon them, at least so far. And they can opt out pretty easily too. If people decide that it's getting too cold, they can just press up on their thermostat and override the settings. And so right now, most of these programs are opt-in and overrideable, but that's not necessarily the case everywhere.
It sounds like customers have a lot of control. They can opt in and out of this as they feel necessary. How much success has a program like this shown? What did they learn?
I think Puget Sound Energy is one of the best examples to look at. They have a number of programs like the Smart Thermostat program where they're trying to shift people's energy usage to different hours. And through all of those programs, they have managed to drop their peak demand by about 1 or 2%. That doesn't sound like a lot, and they're trying to get to 10%. And if they can get to that number, they could conceivably save around $500,000 an hour just by not having to buy that extra power on the wholesale market in the most expensive times.
You know, this is really interesting because people have smart thermostats in their house where they program how they would like their thermostat to play, maybe cooler overnight and warming up, an hour before you get up in the morning. But this control shift is interesting. What does Puget Sound Energy have to do to make something like this, or any power company, acceptable to customers, to turn this over?
I think, they're trying to strike a balance of it being a relatively unnoticeable thing. And that's what I heard from a lot of customers who tried it, is they said it kind of worked in the background and they didn't really notice the temperature going down a couple degrees, to the degree that they can make it less painful and then also optimize the rewards as much as possible so that people notice when they're paid to participate in this program. Those are going to be two keys for it.
At this point, it seems like the power companies are incentivizing people to participate in this program. It gives them a little return. Is this something you anticipate becoming more widespread or even mandatory at some point?
We've seen other places make it mandatory where the grid is more constrained and there's an even tighter shortage of power, such as Nevada. They've made some kinds of these programs mandatory, and we've seen a backlash against it in those places. So I think utilities here know that people like to be able to control their power, and so they are being careful about it. And I think whether we get to a point where utilities make it mandatory here will depend on how tight that shortage of power becomes here.
Well, we're expecting a pretty hot summer, which has me thinking that we may be on the ropes again in terms of power. It seems like trying to address one problem, unclean energy sources, has led to this new one, which is energy shortages. What do you make of that?
We're seeing some challenges in supplying energy, partly because of the solutions we've reached for to address climate change, like adopting electric vehicles and electric heat pumps and winding down coal power plants. And those are all necessary things to slow down or address climate change. But we might not have considered before we started reaching for those solutions whether we had set ourselves up for that. And it doesn't mean those solutions were wrong. It just means we didn't prepare ourselves to really execute those solutions.
I appreciate that answer, Greg Kim. Seattle Times Climate Lab reporter Greg Kim, thanks so much.
Thank you, Trish.
Appreciate you listening to Seattle Now, and thanks to our generous donors for making this show possible, including Tia, Jordan, Kim, Rebecca, and Kate. You make this show go, and we really appreciate it. Today's episode was produced by Brooklyn Jamerson Flowers. It was edited by Caroline Chamberlain Gomez. Our production team also includes Andy Hurst, Vaughn Jones, and Paige Browning. Greg Kramer does our theme music. Seattle Now and KUOW Public Radio are members of the NPR network. I'm Patricia Murphy. See you tonight for Evening Headlines.